Section 402 of another bill that included other issues, called the Combating BDS Act of 2019. That was just passed, but the principal objective or principal basis for that act is that it provides that state laws, that federal law will not preempt state anti-BDS laws. So it's a declaration that the laws that are passed by states or local communities will not be considered to preempt any federal law. There have been, and you'll hear more about these statutory provisions, I think. And also, there have been three cases in the federal courts here in the U.S. over the BDS laws. One in Arkansas, one in Arizona, and one in Kansas. And I'm sure there'll be discussion about that and where those cases are right now. One of them is on appeal to the Ninth Circuit. That's the Arizona case. And in the material that you have, we provided includes briefs that are filed in those cases and the decisions in those cases. It's in the material that we distributed to you. And there's some other copies of that material, I think, over on the sideboard. So you'll hear more about these cases. And basically, in two of the cases, the district courts enjoined enforcement of BDS or issued a preliminary injunction against enforcement of BDS law, the local BDS law. In the Arkansas case, the court dismissed and challenged the BDS law. So I think there'll be more discussion on that. And the Arizona case is the case that's been appealed to the Ninth Circuit. So that's kind of the legal architecture as it exists today. So with that, I'm going to turn the discussion over to Bob Herbst.
I'm sorry, may I just really quickly interject? There are actually people also listening in, so if everybody could just speak loudly, that would be wonderful.
Thank you very much. If anybody has any problem hearing me at any point, just let me know. I usually speak loudly enough, but you never know. So it's great to be here talking with Jewish lawyers and jurists about BDS and the legislation designed to suppress it. I appreciate my good friend and former law partner Steve Bramwell's invitation for Jonathan and I to be part of the discussion here, and our close relationship illustrates the truth that we can passionately disagree about these issues and not only discuss them civilly, but remain very, very close, and I appreciate it. The voices which support Palestinian self-determination, rights, and dignity in Israel-Palestine, which support the nonviolent BDS movement of Palestinian civil society launched in 2005, have just started to pick up steam in the last 2 years, to be heard in the mainstream press and in our politics, which of course accounts for the legislation attempting to suppress those voices, our voices. The constitutional issues are relatively straightforward. They're laid out in the 3 federal court decisions that I provided electronically. Steve has mentioned what they are. I've also provided this brief didn't get into the electronic materials, but it is there on the side. The law professor's amicus brief in the Ninth Circuit in defense of the Arizona decision, the decision that found these laws preliminarily unconstitutional. And I've also provided the ACLU commentaries in 2018-2019, which in summary form make the First Amendment arguments against the congressional bills and the state laws that require state contractors, teachers, lawyers, newspapers, and journalists to certify that they're not participating in politically motivated boycotts against Israel. These arguments essentially are that it is constitutionally impermissible for the government to suppress political speech, expression, and association, and the freedom to engage in group effort for expressive purposes. And that political boycotts, divestment, and sanction advocacy is clearly such association for expressive political speech. We who support BDS do so because we protest Israel's discrimination against Palestinians in Israel in terms of rights and resources, and the utter denial of the right to self-determination and human rights in the occupied territories, and the financing and support of all this by the United States government and the political lobbying organs of that portion of the American Christian and Jewish communities which support the right-wing supremacist policies of the Israeli government vis-a-vis Palestinians. Whether you agree with us or not, it should be beyond dispute that our advocacy of BDS is protected political expression, just as the Montgomery bus boycott was, just as the BDS movement against South African apartheid was. In our view, the 1982 Supreme Court decision, NAACP versus Claiborne, which held that a boycott of all white merchants in a Mississippi county was constitutionally protected. That case, in our view, fully protects BDS adherents from these unconstitutional efforts to suppress their association and speech. Claiborne held, essentially, that states may not prohibit peaceful political activity like that boycott, which is intended to influence governmental action. The Arizona and Kansas courts applied Claiborne to bar enforcement of the anti-Israel boycott bills, noting that collective boycotting activities undertaken to achieve social, political, or economic ends is conduct protected by the First Amendment, and that one cannot separate the expressive political interests from the purchasing decisions of those coming together as a group collectively to boycott. The Arizona law, which penalized any actions, not just boycotts, any actions taken in compliance with or adherence to calls for a boycott of Israel, is quite similar to the language in House Bill H.R. 1697 that Steve mentioned, which prohibits furthering or supporting any boycott of Israel fostered or requested by an international governmental organization. The legislative history of these laws, detailed in those decisions, prove, in our view, beyond doubt, that the intention of the legislators was to suppress speech and political activity opposing Israeli and American policy towards Palestinians. But prohibiting collective actions that express a view of policy that the government doesn't like and wants to suppress doesn't square with the First Amendment. But we're here not just to discuss the constitutional arguments, but the broader implications of these anti-boycott laws. And frankly, I found that how one comes out on the constitutional issues as American Jews is generally determined by how one has evolved. And what do I mean by that? The evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, in a book that I commend to you called The Social Conquest of the Earth, teaches that we have evolved in two mutually irreconcilable ways: to be tribal on the one hand and altruistic on the other. And the struggle between these instincts is what accounts for most of the internal and external conflicts and many of the existential problems which ail us in the world. And he says that our survival as a species depends on our quickly evolving in favor of altruism. That instinct to treat the other as one would treat one's own, and to think of humankind as one global community over tribalism, the instinct to favor one's own family, clan, town, and nation. The great struggle in our politics today is over whether we will adhere to those values. As a Jew and as an American Jew, I believe in universal democratic values. Indeed, one of the enduring contributions of Judaism to human civilization was the promulgation of a set of human values, moral values, ethical values, binding ourselves to humanity as a whole, not just to our tribe. In the United States, Trump's America First, encouraging us to see the other as the enemy, white supremacy, anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, racism, and the like, represents a direct challenge to those who oppose segregation and Jim Crow and mass incarceration and apartheid in South Africa. And there is the same challenge in Israel-Palestine. If you look at the language of the basic Jewish nation-state law, which is discussed in some of the materials that have been tendered, it says the right to exercise national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. I I only started at, I got 3 more minutes. I have 7:22. We're gonna be under, and we are under, that's the reason I'm speaking so quickly is we've agreed to be under 10 minutes each, so we have time for questions. So we're keeping close track of the time.
Yes, we want time for
Okay,
questions.
so the Palestinians, and Jonathan can answer questions about that, are relegated by that basic law to second-class status in their own homeland and deprived of the right to self-determination. BDS protests all that and the American policies which support, facilitate, and finance it. And so you can't view these anti-Israel boycott laws in isolation. You can't ignore their political context. And that's why we need to talk about the political context. They're part of a sustained campaign run in part out of the Israeli Ministry of Strategic Affairs, joined by AIPAC and the Israel Lobby and the state and federal governments to fight Palestinian, Muslim, Christian, and Jewish BDS proponents and to penalize and suppress their political speech and advocacy. They are therefore deeply unconstitutional and frankly un-American in our view. And personally speaking, especially with an audience of predominantly Jewish lawyers, they're not Jewish. It's not Jewish to suppress debate or speech you disagree with. Our rabbis didn't shut up the dissenters among them. They put the dissents right in the commentaries along with the majority opinions. So my submission to you is this: debate us in the marketplace of ideas if you disagree with us. Don't enlist the institutions of the state, the government, to shut us up. Constitutionalizing the government's suppression of political advocacy because you have the power to do so right now is not only wrong, it's dangerous, because in another time, when we are not so powerful, the government could be coming for us. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. All right, I want to keep the conversation as much as possible to the legal issues, but I have to respond to some of what Bob said on what I consider the non-legal issues, namely the political issues. I think, for example, I don't think this is the right forum to have a discussion about the nation-state law. That would be a separate topic we could cover. As far as the legal issues are concerned, and I'll come back to the others, 2 of the 3 courts that have looked at this BDS question disagree with you and have held that 2 of the 3 district courts have held that I'm sorry. Yeah,
Only one of them.
one of the 3 courts, rather, has held, and this is the case that's being appealed to the Ninth Circuit, have held that these BDS laws do not violate the free speech clause of the American Constitution, free speech, First Amendment, because what's involved here is not speech, it's conduct. And conduct itself, especially commercial conduct, which this is not covered by the First Amendment as in the same way that political speech is. Also, the other 2 cases did hold that the law was unconstitutional in the other 2 cases. Those cases will be appealed, I'm sure. But what we're talking about here is commercial conduct. We're not talking about speech. And the boycott case from that you mentioned, the Supreme Court case, had to do with what expressive conduct, which is protected by the First Amendment, on core political issues, core issues of equal rights, core issues of protection for African Americans in that case, in the state of Alabama, and discrimination against individuals. And the boycott was expressive conduct to deal with and combat that kind of discrimination. That is not what the case is here. here in this situation, in terms of these cases. This is not expressive conduct of the sort that is protected by the First Amendment. It is political. It is commercial boycotting. So I don't think that case is apposite, and I think that we'll find on appeal of these cases that position will prevail. So I just want to stay with the law as much as possible in our discussions going forward. So, and I'll let Jonathan take it.
It's good, you stuck to 3 minutes. I'll see what I can do. Okay, thank you very much for inviting me. I'm a Palestinian, obviously, and I recognize that between my people and Palestinian nationalism and the Zionist movement and the State of Israel has been a very big existential conflict and fight with each side really totally rejecting the other. And very early on, I personally came to the view that violence will not work for either side. We will not be able to achieve our objectives by violence alone, that we must seek other methods to deal with it, which is why I moved into law and human rights and things of that sort. The second thing that I realized very early on is not only that violence does not work, but that we must find some kind of common language, some neutral universal standards, whether it's standards of human rights or international law, to try and bring the two parties a little closer together. Because as long as each side is hanging on to its position, obviously, there can be no resolution. What happens, however, if one party refuses to live by those neutral principles, manages through its power to avoid, evade, and not be subject to international law, for example, continues to violate these rights, and what recourse does the other party have? Which is why I thought it was a wonderful thing when Palestinian civil society, and it was civil society, it was not the government, decided to pursue the path of BDS, boycotts, divestments, and sanctions, as a way of non-violently continuing to pursue its objectives. And they were specifically addressing concretely legal rights. For Palestinians who are Israeli citizens, about 20% of the population, they were facing 60 or 70 clearly discriminatory laws topped by the nation state law, which says you are not equal. This land is just for Jews, and that you have no right of self-determination, and that you're seeking equality is somehow not acceptable. Another portion of the Palestinian people were living under occupation for over half a century now, with no end in sight. And international law pertaining to belligerent occupation, which is the legal status of these territories, is being violated left, right, and center, with no possibility of recourse through international bodies, since the United States uses its veto power to prevent any concrete steps being taken. Not to mention the Palestinians who have been in exile, whether they fled on their own or were forced out, are all forcibly being denied the right to re-enter and go back to their land. What recourse do we have that fulfills these two conditions of not being violent, because we certainly don't want violence, and of appealing to neutral principles, other than to seek some concrete measures like BDS. I thought that that would be welcome as an attempt to deal with this crisis in a more civilized way. Instead, the State of Israel, under its current government, decided that BDS is a tremendous existential threat, worse and more dangerous even than the Iranian bomb, and decided to put tremendous resources, including a ministerial position, working mostly in a clandestine fashion, literally using hundreds of millions of dollars every year, and marshaling its friends abroad in an all-out attack on BDS movements. And why is it that this attack is being pursued? The BDS movement is being continuously slandered as a way to justify this type of attack. And there have been three major arguments against it that I'd like to address quickly. The first is that it is anti-Semitic, that it is simply used against Jews as Jews, that these boycotts, these divestment, the seeking of sanction is being uniquely and specifically aimed only at Jews as Jews, which is of course not at all the case with the BDS. BDS makes it very clear that they are seeking equality. Their targets have been, they started with Caterpillar, not a Jewish company, which created these D9 bulldozers that have become the symbol, really, of Israeli violence against the Palestinians, more so than tanks or guns. Then SodaStream, which again is a company that operates in the occupied territories as a way of targeting the West Bank settlements and the West Bank occupation. So that the goal has not been to boycott specifically Jewish organizations, but to boycott Israeli and Israeli-related organizations that are directly involved in the type of oppression of Palestinian rights in favor of equality, in favor of human rights, in favor of international law. The second major argument has been is that boycotts by their very nature, because of the history of the area, is really something that you shouldn't use, especially against Jews. Because of the history of the Nazis using boycotts of Jewish businesses. Although this really sidesteps the issue, because boycotting a vulnerable community in order to delegitimize it and take over its businesses and prevent it from having equal status is totally different than boycotting a powerful and dominant group by the oppressed people seeking equality and seeking rights. I have 7 minutes here. I'm keeping track. The third argument, and perhaps the most interesting one, is that the BDS delegitimizes the State of Israel. And those who use this argument may have some legitimacy if they take the discrimination of the State of Israel, its exclusivity, its control over others, and its denial of Palestinian rights to be of the essence of the Israeli state. In that case, yes, BDS does delegitimize those things. But if one is working and talking about equality and human rights and equal dignity and compliance with international law, then what is being delegitimized really is only those oppressive policies. I will stop here, and I'm still well below the 10.
I'm going to stand up because I'm small. And actually that point brings us, what we're talking about here, brings us to some very interesting concepts. Just because we use the words human rights dignity, peace, and we say this is what we're all about, is like me saying, telling everybody, I'm 6'6". It doesn't make me a basketball player just because I say it. And I speak to you with an English accent, because as Bob said, we're here only 2 years into this. I'm 20 years into this, having seen the BDS movement in Britain that started. And now we see with the Labour Party and the entrenched anti-Semitism that's been there, that the BDS movement, if we can call it a cohesive movement, we could call it an industry as well at the moment, because it's been openly admitted that there's a huge amount of money going into the BDS industry itself, and that people's lives and money depends upon that, has been used as a tool of anti-Semitism that we see endemic within the Labour Party within Britain. So when we saw those BDS groups in Britain, like Students for Justice for Palestine, who were they targeting on campus in Britain? They were targeting the Jewish movement, the Jewish JSOC. I had to deal with this in 1995 in Britain. And when we talk, and when Bob says, yes, we are the product of our evolution, you're damned right I am. I am the grandson of Jews of Arab lands. And when we look at those Jews of Arab lands, of the 850,000 that were displaced from all the littoral coast of North Africa, Syria, Lebanon, etc., yes, I do look towards the bait and switch that's going on within the BDS, where the BDS movements, when they chant, from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free, because what they said to those Jews of Arab lands was as follows. They said, you now have a place for you to go in 47 and 48, get out, such that Syria is now completely and utterly Judenrein. There's not one Jew left there. Where Iraq, Iran, Sudan, Libya, and it goes on and it goes on, they were told to then go and live in Israel. And now what's being said? Well, actually, from the river to the sea, Palestine should be free, and we want to delegitimize that state. The BDS movement itself, as we call it that is one debate. The other debaters that were supposed to be set up today is, well, let's talk about the law that is being proposed. Is that law constitutional? Does Congress have the right to regulate boycott actions, especially when called for IGOs? Is this merely an extension of the Arab League boycotts, which has stood for over 30 years as the evolution of the Export Administration Act, and has been held time and time again by the courts to be constitutional? We could hypothetically talk about the individual states' laws and talk about NAACP versus Claiborne, which, as Steve rightly pointed out, was about individuals looking to vindicate their individual and personal rights. Or does a movement itself have the right, and should companies be protected from the UNHCR from blacklisting other companies and putting out document demands upon companies and saying, you have to respond to our document demands because we are the regulating authority? Just months after NAACP versus Claiborne came out, we had the case of the International Longshoremen case versus Allied International that came out that specifically stated that the First Amendment does not protect commercial boycotts when there is a federal law which itself sets itself up to regulate boycotts as a valid expression of foreign policy. Because what the Export Administration Act, as amended, was looking to achieve was to say, we are Americans, and I say this now with my broad, we are Americans, and we have the right to regulate with whom we do business, and we're not going to have other states telling us who we can do business with, and we're not going to have now, according to the proposed change in the law, we're not going to have the UNHCR, and it clearly states on the face of the Act, have themselves indulged in a discriminatory practice of boycotts against Israel. Now, whilst the BDS movement, as Jonathan may have said, the BDS movement itself might have started as, well, what else are we supposed to do? Well, And I was talking to my sister about this, and I'm not certainly the expert on peace building. She is. She's a professor at UCL that specializes in conflict resolution. I said, and I posed that question, well, you know, what are people supposed to do in these circumstances? And she said, do you know, well, first and foremost, you've got to know within the Arab world, there's only one country at the moment that is sympathetic to the Palestinians, even remotely sympathetic to the Palestinians, and that itself in Israel. She said, who do you think is going to build the desalination plants? Who's going to provide the infrastructure? Certainly not going to be Jordan, who've been suppressing their 6.5 million Palestinian residents, and in fact took away 2 years ago the identity cards of 500,000 Palestinians purely for being Palestinians. It's going to be Israel. The people are going to be providing the economic impetus into Gaza to build the port, to build the infrastructure, is going to be Israel. But yes, here's a very good idea. Let's try and harm them economically so they've got less willingness to be able to put that in themselves. There was a recent Arab Human Development Report, which was written by the Arab world, by thinkers from the Arab world and not Western thinkers, that look towards what has been the state failure within the Arab world, and it's been 3 points. Political intolerance, lack of a first world education, and lack of gender equality. Now, taking that into account, and whilst the BDS industry may well state, well, we've got our industry to support, it might be better to take those monies and put them into trying to combat political intolerance, lack of first world education, and lack of gender inequality that is there within the Palestinian state. Maybe take those monies and start to, if you want to empower people, what else are we supposed to do? Lobby the Arab world to empower people, bring their businesses to Gaza, bring the businesses to what's being called the occupied territories, and let's start to build up proper businesses to empower people on the ground. And once they say, look, all we want to do is the right to say our piece. But let's look at what that right is. I want to have the right to exclude you. I want to have the right as BDS to stop an Israeli academic coming and speaking into America. All we're looking to do is to say our piece, whilst at the same time looking to say their piece. It's so circular, the argument, that it is practically nonsensical. If you're looking to have legitimate dialogue betwixt people, between people, then what you do is you share ideas. What you don't do is say to someone like SodaStream, you're not allowed to give those Palestinians 900 jobs. In fact, we want you to relocate, take yourself into Israel, give 900 Jews or Israelis their jobs, and who are now looking at a massive windfall because Pepsi's taken them over. We can look at it from the legal perspective, and you've got a long legislative history within the United States where post-Arab League. Oh, I'm so sorry for being over my time. I could take another minute debating that.
One minute. We've got one more minute.
Or, so we've got the long legislative history there, or you could even look towards and say, what is the BDS at this point looking to achieve? And if you're saying we've got the right to exclude other people, that in my mind's eye isn't in keeping with the concepts of peace, justice, dignity, and dialogue.
Okay. Open it up now to discussion.
I nominate these two guys to bring the peace process to a head. Because there were times that he was nodding his head in approval, and other times when he said no. So, you know,
You think Rob and Jonathan should sit down?
and you and Steve can kind of be the moderator.
We'll need a
Trying to be the moderator, but yes.
Thank you very much, Steve, for bringing us all together. I think there are very few places, unfortunately, where both sides, I shouldn't say sides, but it is what it is, kind of communicate and talk, so that's highly valuable. Thank you very much for doing it. I have a question for the Palestinian lawyer among us. I don't think we have too many. If you look at the Israeli political map today, I dare to say 90-95% of Israelis and Israeli political parties see the BDS as a very negative phenomenon, and they work very hard in the States and around the world to make sure that it's not successful. When I grew up in Israel many years ago, center-left, of the political map worked and expressed views with respect to Palestinian human rights very differently. For me, it shows me that Israel has changed a lot, the Israeli leadership has changed a lot, and it's just very, very hard to explain Israel and the rest of the world that BDS should exist in this context where most Israelis disagree with your position. How do you perceive this change within the Israeli context, and how do you why do you say that? Maybe we should start that, because obviously other people have other questions.
Yeah.
Because I think it's a very important part of the story that
Yes.
it's basically 95% of Israelis disagree with.
Well, Israeli Jews, I assume you mean.
Actually, even among Arabs, many of them feel very, very uncomfortable with many of the positions you expressed today.
Okay, I think it's true that the Israelis have moved very much to the right in the last 5 or 10 years. 10 years definitely. Opinions that were totally intolerable even within Likud. I mean, the entire Likud faction walked out when the Kahanists stood up to speak. Today they're inviting them into the government. We have seen this on the ground, that Israelis today feel much more comfortable holding on to all the land, keeping all the settlements, denigrating Arabs, not accepting them as equals, even within Israel, not just the occupied territories. Now, part of it may be because of the resistance. Palestinians did not accept the Israeli perimeters, what they were offering them. Part of it may be power. They have power, and they have gotten away with it. They have not been at all forced to pay any price, diplomatically, economically, or otherwise, for their continued occupation of the territories they took in 1967. So they feel emboldened. They feel they can get away with it. That the Goyim can say whatever they want. What's important is what the Jews do. And in that sense, BDS comes as a challenge. It says they're not only going to say something, they're going to do something. In a way, freedom of expression also includes doing something. Burning a flag, making a demonstration, not just talking, but actually concretely doing something, however little, becomes a real challenge to total Israeli power.
Yes. Did that answer your question?
May I challenge you just a little bit? I mean, I refer specifically to the Israeli left, people who've been promoting human rights for 50 years, and they say we're big human rights supporters. Many of them are top international lawyers, and they disagree with your anti-BDS position.
Within their own mind, they think of themselves as being very progressive and very leftist. I've always had my questions about that. I've had many good friends in the left, and I was disappointed by them. When we come to concrete action, they seem to withdraw.
Yes.
We keep moving from the legal to the political, and the real question here is not whether BDS has the right to speak. I think 95% of the people, maybe 100% of the people here, would agree that BDS supporters have the right to speak.
I should hope so.
The question is, if the legislature decides, as a matter of public policy, that although BDS people have the right to speak, that companies that boycott the state of Israel, institutions that boycott the state of Israel, are against American public policy, and consequently they are deprived of the opportunity to do business with government. They're free to do business with every other person, every other consumer, every other company. But they cannot do business with the government because that's against American policy.
Now, let me answer your question.
And consequently, why is not that
Constitution.
within the same bounds as if we were not talking about BDS, but we were talking about the Nazi Party in 1940 in the United States. Nazis that were murdering Jews, they were murdering Poles, they were doing all of those things. And at the same time, if the government had said a company that does business with the Nazis can't do business with the United States government, everybody would have applauded, and in fact they did, because there were such laws at the time, and at no time did the Supreme Court or any appellate court I'm aware of say that those laws were against the Constitution. Why is it different? Because we're dealing with anti-Semitism, which is okay as long as you don't call it anti-Semitism.
Okay, so let me take part of the question, because the Nazi, whatever happened before the war, the Second World War, is even beyond my ken, because I wasn't around. But I will tell you that in the Claiborne decision, okay, which is the decision that the two courts, the Kansas and the Arizona court, applied, is very clear. It holds that collective activity, not individual speech, but collective boycott activity cannot be suppressed by a government, state or federal, when the intention of the government is to suppress views it doesn't like, and when it's the intention of the boycotters to express their political views. Now, wait a minute.
Wait, Bob, that's not correct.
Wait a minute. Yes,
the Claiborne decision was based on
Can I finish?
using a boycott to advance and protect the individual interests, constitutional rights of those people who are doing the boycott.
Okay, let's
That's
take
a very different situation than you have in this case. Where this is a matter of a political position regarding the state of Israel versus the Palestinian state and so forth. It's
Okay,
very different. That's why Claiborne does not.
Let's look at the Kansas decision which applied Claiborne, all right? Who was the plaintiff in that case? The plaintiff was a public school coach and a member of the Mennonite church who was complying with his church's resolution calling on all Mennonites to take steps to address the injustice and violence to Palestinians arising out of the Israeli occupation of Palestine, and to boycott products associated with the occupation.
That's a political position.
That's right. It is a political position, and the boycott is political. Excuse me a minute. If the boycott is intended to express a political position that the government doesn't agree with, it cannot suppress it, and that's what she was doing, and that's what the court held. Applying Claiborne.
Can I
It's very different. Let me.
just one point of
The right of African Americans to against discriminatory practices that existed at the time of Claiborne is entirely different, totally different in terms of the expressive aspect of the First Amendment than a political position about BDS or Israel or the Palestinians.
What distinguishes the Palestinians from the blacks in the civil rights movement?
Because this is an opinion they have. It's not. You can have your opinions. I mean, you can go out and you can talk in any forum. You can write whatever you want, but you can't engage in this kind of a boycott.
Claiborne said boycott.
You don't, because it's not going to your core rights.
Of course it is.
It's a political opinion. It has nothing to do with it.
Can I just deal with one point
That's
here?
why you're going to lose.
One point here. Generally, there is a difference between the state boycott, legislations has been dealt with, and the Israel Anti-Boycott Act. The Israel Anti-Boycott Act does not have anywhere within it that the state will refuse to do, when I say the state, the country, US government, will refuse to do business with any business. The sanctions there are, or the penalties are monetary and monetary only. There's a difference between that. This state legislation does say that those individual states will refuse to do business with those that engage in a boycott.
I'm
It's all
sorry,
just-
the House bill says that it prohibits furthering or supporting any boycott of Israel. Supporting a boycott is advocacy.
Supporting
It's
a boycott
speech.
how?
You can't, that's right, it's unlimited. It doesn't,
it's not unlimited.
it
Well-
is, it doesn't say what it
It's
was.
not
I
unlimited
think-
because it's not speech.
And it's only Israel. The
My
only,
own-
the only boycott that's actionable is that
Well,
against Israel.
well, that's because you're not but that's what BDS
what other
isn't
boycott is
targeting
there?
Jordan.
Well-
They're not targeting Saudi for its actions on the Yemenis.
But that's the
I
point.
think
That shows why the legislation is targeted at a political position, a political advocacy. You can't do that in the
You
United
can
May I-
States.
advocate all you
may
want,
I-
you can't
may I-
boycott them.
may I
That's
say
a different
something?
type of action.
I think on this issue,
That's what Claiborne said.
Let Jonathan speak.
I like and I agree with the position of the ACLU, which is, universally speaking, in terms of other countries, really quite an extreme position. In the United States, we have a constitution that supports our rights to speak, even on issues where the majority of the population feels otherwise. One of my proudest moments as a US citizen was when there was a unanimous Supreme Court decision written by Rehnquist of all people, holding unconstitutional those state laws that prohibited the burning and desecration of the flag. In most of the countries of the world, that is a crime. That would not be allowed. But the US Supreme Court says, unanimously, even its right-wing justices, that in this country, we will allow you to speak even if this flag will protect even those who despise it. This type of freedom of expression, which includes, by the way, boycotts and marches and collective actions, is an extreme position.
But-
I agree.
but it doesn't
And
international-
this is why, by the way, in this case, I am certain that we will prevail in the High Court. The courts will see this as an expression. They may not like the message of BDS. They may not like our anti-occupation, anti-Israeli position. They may be persuaded that this is part of a struggle taking place somewhere else in another part of the world. But the fact that you are here shows that this struggle is of concern to US citizens as well, that they are investing heavily in time, political energy, and effort in this struggle. So this is not the Nazis wanting to discriminate against other people. This is people wanting and demanding equality, wanting and demanding freedom, wanting and demanding compliance with international law, and using their political collective action in that direction. And I'm proud that in the United States, that type of action is still legal and is protected by the
It's
Constitution.
different than the flag burning case, but I won't, go ahead.
All right, thank you. This has been really interesting, and I want to, from my understanding, the NAACP, the context for that case is very important. There were businesses engaged in unlawful discriminatory conduct against African Americans, violating their constitutionally protected equal protection rights, and the court legitimately upheld that to boycott unlawful conduct, discriminatory conduct, is protected. By contrast, what appears to be, and this leads into a general question as opposed to just a statement, by contrast, what seems to be the case with the anti-BDS, the Israel Anti-Boycott Act, and the other anti-BDS legislation is they're protecting lawful conduct as opposed to the NAACP. There was a boycott of unlawful conduct, and in this case, I think at least the way many people, pro-Israel advocates and those who support the BDS legislation view it as necessary legislation in order to protect the aggrieved party, to combat discriminatory conduct and essentially discrimination based on nationality and national origin, where companies are being singled out just by virtue of the fact that they happen to be Israeli companies. They lose economic opportunity in the U.S. and this also relates to something that Jonathan, that you mentioned, articulately, and I wish it was the case, that we should welcome the BDS movement in that it, in a way, shifts the conflict away from violent means and towards sort of public policy, diplomacy. But I don't think that is borne out in reality, where now it's just the violence is still there, and this is just another route of isolating and attacking the Jewish state. It's not as if it has replaced or mitigated the violence. The violence, unfortunately, is still there, and the same proponents are those supporting the BDS movement. So I guess my question is, I would really enjoy a response to Robert Herbst. There are a lot of similar names here. There's two Roberts, but
Robert
Garson.
Yeah, that's Garson, and this is
all right. So the Robert on that side of the room. In any event, who essentially made a case that there is. What is we all want the same resolution of peace and prosperity in two countries, many of us at least, two states living side by side in peace. What is, in your view, the route to get there? Is economic isolation, as the BDS movement would have it, more beneficial or less beneficial than an environment in which there is a cross-border economic collaboration? And the very last point is, I genuinely would like to know if if BDS was fully successful, is there a Palestinian environment and landscape that would then lead towards a peaceful resolution? In other words, what is the end game for the BDS movement if it's fully successful, and how do you respond to the fact that it is hurting economic collaboration and coexistence?
Okay, well, those are a lot of questions.
May I add a dovetailed question to that? Also, I just want to be clear, because we're talking about the legal framework of the ultimate goals of the BDS movement, because I've heard lots of different things about what the ultimate goal is. The ultimate goal, a statement against occupation, and then I heard from Mr. Herbst talking a lot about actually things going on in Israel proper, not even in the West Bank. So I just would like just a little bit of for the speakers to speak a little bit also about
just information. The BDS movement is, it's true, a loosely collected group. When forced to talk about their political goals, they stated 3 goals: full equality within Israel, 2, an end to the occupation, 3, the right of return. Also, BDS operates on the basis of local groups choosing campaigns based on what they see are priorities. Most BDS groups that I know concentrate on occupation, settlements, settlement products, and corporations that directly are involved in oppressive actions, such as building the walls, providing the caterpillars that destroy the houses, that are involved in actually more suppressive activities. So you must know, when you're talking about the BDS, what you're talking about. You're talking about people in civil society who want to address certain grievances, who don't want to do it through violence, but who want to use the international community, international law, universal concepts of human rights in a non-violent fashion. And this sudden tremendous demonization of BDS and this involvement of so many resources, including black ops, including going after individuals who are activists in the BDS movement in the United States, in secret, to really ruin their reputation, prevent them from having employment. If you're talking about people being really targeted, that is what is taking place with the anti-BDS movement here in the United States, on students, colleges, and campuses with huge amounts of money. I don't know what you're talking about, by the way, when you talked about funding the BDS movement and all the money. Who's admitted how much money is going into the BDS movement?
Billions of dollars.
Where?
Are going into the billions of dollars.
Yeah,
I wish somebody
what's
would.
your source for that?
First, there are large amounts of sources that we can go
Where?
back and go through. What do you mean where?
Get me one.
Where is? Look,
Get me one. Get me a number. Get me a source.
One thing that I think
A lot
we've
of
hit-
money is going.
One thing I think
Where?
we've hit upon very clearly here is that with what they're talking about the BDS is there's no clear message coming out as to, are we dealing with one state solution two-state solution, are they looking for two states to live side by side, or are they looking for a single-state solution, right, which in and of itself is a bit like me asking my child what you want, because they'll come out with a broad statement of a panacea of all goods. Because within that, you can't just say, well, if they're going to be talking about a single-state solution, we could say, which country is there in this world at the moment which, after an entrenched system or an entrenched history of political, ethnic, and religious divide, has come together in any form of cohesive way in a single country? Bosnia certainly hasn't. It's completely non-functional. Are we going to be looking at a situation like Lebanon, where one has a minority ruling party like the Maronite Christians who are looking out over everybody else? Iraq, maybe. Afghanistan would be a great one to try and look through in the world. Would we be having a first past the post system, a proportional representation system of representation, or would it be more a federal system of representation if within one state? However, if the BDS is talking about we're looking at a two-state solution, then we are looking at Israel being the contiguous land partner to the Palestinian, to the new Palestinian state, and economically the contiguous partner, which will then include necessarily Jordan and Egypt coming into the fray. Because there is no doubt that prosperity comes from economic prosperity of the people themselves, not all the monies that have been plowed into building tunnels. Like, it's really sad what's gone on in Gaza. They've obviously got the skills to build tunnels. They could have built a bloody subway system there, right? Rather than terror tunnels that have come through. That's taken money and aid coming in from the government.
Let's let someone come back.
I actually have a question. Does the state laws and the proposed federal laws bleed into the giving of social services? For example, if I were a member of a church group that had adopted or advocated BDS, and I wanted to get a mortgage that the state was giving, or any kind of social service, or to contract with the state to say I'm a contractual psychiatric worker.
Yeah, you wouldn't be able to do that.
I wouldn't be able to do that, even though my church said that.
Right. So his boycott, the Mennonites boycotting activity had nothing to do with his job. He was trying to contract with the state to attend a program at which he would make some additional money in his role as a teacher. So it had nothing to do with it. So your answer is yes. These laws can be very, very broad. They say basically if you want to comply with the church resolution, BDS resolution of your church, you can't contract with the state.
Provided the BDS resolution has commercial boycott as its conduct. If the BDS resolution was simply we abhor the actions of the state of Israel, we want to have nothing to do with it, fine. But if it says
no, that's not.
No,
that is not
fine.
true.
But if it said we will not use our funds in support of companies doing business in Israel, then the law would apply.
Correct.
Yes.
So if a church or an organization had, for example, some churches or groups have endowments, and they said their endowment is not going to invest in SodaStream,
Right.
so then they would suffer these sanctions.
Correct.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know.
I'm gonna go off a bit of a tangent, but I wanna ask, has anyone here had personal experience with BDS? Because I wanted to hear Itzhak Perlman, who's international superstar, accompanied by the Israel Philharmonic, and I had to walk a gauntlet under the protection of the city police, our guys, and just to be able to enter this concert, and I had never seen anything like that before. And I also know from friends who are at Columbia University that certain coursework, which is fairly factual oriented, but of a certain particular content, has had a very, it has been silenced essentially. So we're not going only commercial. This is cultural. I mean, a philharmonic orchestra or
So you were
coursework.
saying there were protests
Against, it was
Israel.
the Israeli Philharmonic Orchestra, mostly Itzhak Perlman, who's an international figure.
Right.
And it was very intimidating, frankly. I certainly went, but.
And they have the
what
right
is
to
this?
protest, I mean, the
Yeah.
right to breaking the law, you know, in some way.
Right.
But I think that's very different than the BDS myself. Okay, so I think we're not.
I just wanted to, I had a question about the laws related to something you were saying, and also I think in terms of your question about social services, if it's an individual looking for social services, the laws don't apply, the state laws, because it's not about an individual contract.
Unless they have to sign a statement,
Certification, but they would only have
certification.
to sign a certification if they're acting as a corporate entity, and in places where they have gotten those, like the hurricane relief situation in Texas, it was found that that was not in compliance with the law, and nothing, they were being overzealous in giving out the certifications. So the law itself would not require someone to do that.
Actually, the law, the Arizona law, which was also struck down, involved a lawyer who, whose firm was asked to certify that that his firm had no affiliation with the boycott of Israel, even though he was a sole practitioner. And what the court held, because that argument was made, and the court held that the law affected both him and his firm.
So I'm glad you brought up that case, because my question is related to that, right? In the Arkansas decision, they mention the Longshoremen's case, and they say that it's because you would have to explicitly express what the commercial activity is, right? The fact that in Arizona he didn't buy an HP printer, right? He wouldn't certify it because he said, I won't buy an HP printer because I'm boycotting HP as part of my being a member of JVP and being part of the BDS movement. So my question, because you brought up earlier how NAACP versus Claiborne relates in this situation because it's an individual issues, and then you gave kind of the background on looking at the situation, but how is the situation is different, right? If they're not how do you prove, if I'm boycotting HP printers, I don't buy an HP printer and I buy a Dell printer, right? And you buy a Dell printer just because it's cheaper, right? How do you know that unless I tell you?
Here's what the Arizona court said to the argument that the certificate.
I want to know your argument.
Well, you asked a legal question. My legal argument is congruent with what the Arizona court decided. It said that the defendants argue that the certification requirement doesn't implicate the First Amendment because it only regulates commercial conduct, and plaintiffs may say absolutely anything they desire about Israel. It said, even though the act does not expressly limit speech, its terms limit collective engagement in types of political expression that the Supreme Court has found to fall within the First Amendment protections. So when you band together with others, and this is what Claiborne holds, when you band together with others to express a political view, that's protected activity. The government can't suppress it because it doesn't like it. And
The government's not suppressing.
excuse me, the court went on to say
do business with the government under certain conditions.
the court went on.
That's very different.
The court went on to say that
They can express it all they want.
yeah, but
Till the cows come home.
no, but what you object to is not the expression by individuals. What you are objecting to is the individuals coming together in a cohesive group.
Look,
to take action. And obviously, individuals, Jonathan said, individual Palestinians have been speaking to the wind for decades, and it hasn't improved their situation any. Question is, do they have a right to band together and take a boycott, divestment, and sanction activity?
Yes.
Is it protected by the First Amendment? And the answer is yes.
not as against these. The governments have the right to impose conditions on doing business with the government in order to further the interests of the government, right? I mean, that there's lots of cases that tell you that that's okay.
Not when the
That's all
basic
right.
purpose of the
No,
banding
but
together is to express a political position against what the government doesn't
protest
like.
all they want about Israel and so forth and so on.
That's the
And
issue.
nothing is stopping them from doing that, but the government has the right to impose conditions on a government, in entering into a government contract, which further the interests of the government.
Okay, so
Right?
far.
And this is very different than Claiborne, as I've been saying, and others have said here this morning.
Well,
Very different than Claiborne.
Is this any different
because
from
this-
affirmative action? If a contractor wants to build that building over there, doesn't he have to sign an agreement with the city and the state saying that he employs all kinds of people and diversity and
Yes.
all those kind of things? Is this any different?
Yes.
No.
Why?
Yes.
Why?
Because when
That's what I-
you employ people and you build a building, you can't discriminate among your employees or your customers, okay?
Okay.
That's a purely economic activity.
No,
When
it's
you
not
build a
purely
building,
economic.
wait a minute.
It's
when
not
you-
purely
Wait a
economic.
minute, when you build a building, you're not expressing a view that Palestinian rights are being ignored in Israel and by the United States government. That's the difference here.
It's no difference.
No different.
There's no
I'll
difference.
tell you what.
The other thing, the question I want to ask before, maybe this is a solution. It was talk about modifying the language in both the Act Before Congress and some of the state statutes as well. Talk about boycott in general. Don't mention the word Israel, don't mention the word Jews, don't mention the word Arabs, don't mention the word Palestinian, nothing. If you discriminate and if you boycott and if you do all these kind of things against anybody, we're not going to do business with you.
Well, first of all, none of these acts do that. And,
I'm asking
and therefore,
why,
and therefore it's called under
I'm asking you as a
inclusivity.
lawyer, if they put that kind of general language, yes, it may be a little too general.
That's pretty
But if you
general.
put that kind of general language in it, does it then appease everybody?
No, actually it doesn't,
Why
because
not?
if it's intended, as the legislative history of all these acts make clear, if it's intended to suppress political advocacy, it runs afoul of the First
But you're not
Amendment.
discriminating against
You
not
can't
Jews,
get
Palestinians,
beyond.
or anybody else. It's anybody.
Bob, it's not.
Restricts
It
the
is
boycott
action.
action.
It's
It's
action.
It's
They can
anybody.
speak all they want.
Let me ask you, when you burn the flag, is it action?
Yes,
Of
but
course
that's,
it's an
that's
action.
because
You
Is
have
it
to match to
speech?
the
It's
flag.
not a commercial
yes, because
act.
that
It's
is
not commercial
speech,
conduct.
because that
It's
goes
not
to the
speech.
core
But at this
rights
You
of
point-
didn't say
Americans.
anything, you just lit a match.
That goes to the core expressive rights of an American citizen.
And so does
No,
so
this
does
doesn't. This has to do with an
BDS.
issue in Israel.
Believe me, it's core.
Israel and the Palestinians, that has nothing to do
It's a
with
free
core
country.
rights
Why
of
would I drink
an
Coca-Cola
American
instead of
citizen. I'm
Pepsi
sorry.
Cola? Does that mean I'm
This is,
boycotting Pepsi
this is
Cola?
why I say
You're
you
wrong.
can't ignore the political context of this. This is not just about Israeli policy. This is about American policy, and the American policy that finances, supports,
Well,
and facilitates
get-
occupation. That's
you
what
wanna
that's
get-
about.
I think that lady wants to.
Haven't addressed the issues of the endgame and sort of
Okay.
About the economic vision of just an
May I-
opposite view.
yeah. I think
Jonathan
I
wants to
mean,
do that.
especially.
Yeah,
Well, I mean, from both of your perspectives, you're an American Jew who lives in America. You don't live in Israel. You don't have to live day-to-day life as a right-wing Israeli, as a left-wing Israeli, as a right-wing Palestinian, a left-wing Israeli.
Yeah, but Israel
There's
speaks,
some Americans
Israel
who think
purports
they
to
do.
speak for me, so I have an interest.
And then on the other side, which is an interesting perspective, I mean, you live in Ramallah, you move back, and just in terms of the future vision of what are things
in Jerusalem,
supposed to-
actually.
in an ideal world, what would things look like
Okay.
in terms of economic
This is-
rise, which seems to be a key component.
This is a very important question.
Right.
And it's a conversation that we need to have, and I'm not sure we can have it here, but I'm glad to continue this conversation. We are at a crisis point. Neither Palestinians nor Israelis can achieve everything they want. They certainly cannot achieve it through violence. There has to be some kind of new vision that incorporates both sides' interests. This cannot be an exclusively Jewish state or an exclusively Arab state. For a time, people thought that the two-state solution provides such a compromise. Unfortunately, when you move 700,000 Jews into the area that is supposed to be a Palestinian state, and they demand the right to stay there as Israelis, not as equals with whoever is living there, under different laws, different services, different roads, different courts. Then you make that two-state solution very, very difficult, if not impossible to achieve. So you must start thinking out of the box and thinking new ways. Unfortunately, you can't even begin to move in that direction when there is such a huge power imbalance. When Israel controls all the area, when Israel controls everybody who even comes in, even as visitors, and who leaves. When Israel controls the entire economy, the land, the sky above it, the cyber waves, the imports, the exports, the water underneath is all controlled by Israel. Given that imbalance of power, it's hard to come up with a vision that allows both to live. So we must do something. Either we refer the entire thing to some kind of international tribunal, or we have to do something to balance out the situation so that they can deal with each other. It's not going to be easy for us or for the Israelis.
So taking that a step forward, you win at the International Tribunal, the Palestinians win the case, and then what does tomorrow look like? The end in terms of
Exactly.
the end of the day.
If you ask me personally, my vision, personally, for a long time I was the advocate of a two-state solution. Now I no longer see it possible, precisely because of all the settlers and the settlements. And I don't want to uproot them. They don't want to be uprooted. So there has to be a new vision that incorporates all of Israel and Palestine.
And all of the inhabitants of the
and
land.
yes, when you talk about from the river to the sea, Palestine must be free, we're talking about genuine equality. It's so different from either the Palestinian, either the Arab view of Palestine Arabiyya, or the Israeli view of a Jewish state.
There's
It's
room
a
for two
new
homelands.
reality.
So I just want to make sure that I'm understanding correctly. You would not support the idea in any configuration, 67 green lines, whatever, of a Jewish state, a state that would support Jewish self-determination next to a state that would support Palestinian self-determination. That what you're saying is that
I'm
you have to
saying
leave that idea aside.
that was for a long time, that was something I worked personally very hard for before it became the public official position of the Palestinian Authority and the PLO. I am saying that now you have a different reality. What will you do with all these Jewish settlers? Now, don't say Israeli. They are Jewish settlers in the occupied territories. Are they going to become Palestinian citizens, or do they want to continue to be Israeli citizens enjoying all the rights of Israeli citizens?
Jonathan, look, this is where I was getting back to previously, that there is not one recognized international peace thinker that gets to the point that there's not going to be another 200 years of conflict if there were to be one contiguous state. There will be 200 years of conflict if you try to put everybody together.
Why not?
Right?
Why not?
Because
The Germans and the French should get together.
The Germans are having their own particular problems at the moment. So let's not try and elevate them to a point there.
I'm saying there is hope. There is vision. There are possibilities.
One of the biggest questions at the moment in the peace world is how Israel, because it's going to be Israel providing those monies, how Israel can provide infrastructure to Gaza and to the Palestinian Authority without empowering either Hamas or Fatah at the same time. When you've got Abbas entering his 14th year of his 4-year term, of his 4-year original term, it's very difficult in order to be able to deal with that.
So you don't have a solution?
No. My solution is a two-state solution. However, because I come from a position that when there are no Jews living in Syria, 3 Jews living in Iraq, no Jews living in across the rest of the Arab lands practically. There needs to be one place on this earth that is a place where Jews can have self-determination. And I come unashamedly from that position, because otherwise all those that were excluded from Egypt, there's even a place called Smuha City, named after the Smuha family, after the king of Egypt. Said, "You are such good Egyptians, we're going to name Smuha City." There's not one Jew living there now, right? Unless Jews have a place where they have self-determination, there won't be any Jews left in the Middle East.
Jews have self-determination now over the entire land, from the river to the sea. The people that don't have self-determination are the millions of Palestinians who live there, for which you care nothing.
And in Jordan, not at all. I care greatly. There's 6.5 million in Jordan as well. I care very
It
greatly.
requires a two-state solution.
Okay.
Anyone
I
else
think
wanna-
I'd like to end on a positive note, if I may. If I may.
Okay, you go ahead and then I'll.
If I may. I know these issues are very, very difficult. And I know there are great passions on both sides. And whatever solution you come up with, there are all sorts of obstacles, difficulties. There are people who are nefarious and will try to undermine it. I would like, however, for us to start with a few general principles that we think are applicable. We can start with the principle that violence doesn't work, that it's bad, that you don't need more violence, more weapons, more strength, more oppression to force your way. We can start with the idea of equality, the idea of basic human decency, the idea of human rights, the idea that people are people. They're not animals or cockroaches or one superior special people and others who are nobodies. You start with human dignity, human respect, dialogue, openness, rather than sheer power and force and forcing your way on others. If we start along those lines, then we can move a little bit, maybe in small steps, in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Who wants to?
Can I ask one question actually for somebody who's on one of our board members who is on the phone? Had a few quick questions for Bob Herbst. This is from Michael Treason from on our board. So he asked, would you have opposed calls by American Jews?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear you.
I'm sorry. Would you have opposed calls by American Jews for a boycott of Germany in 1938-39? Would you have defended calls in Germany and Poland for boycotting Jews? That's part of one question. The other question is, are you troubled by the phenomenon that while Israel is the subject of boycott strategies, other countries aren't, even though they are human rights violators?
I am. Because I think there needs to be other boycotts, and I think of Saudi Arabia as being a nice target for boycotts. I can think of others also.
I agree with that, and I have not studied the issues of the boycotts in Germany that went both ways, but I was part of the BDS movement with respect to South Africa and apartheid, and there were no anti-South African boycott bills, even though it took 20 years for that BDS movement to provide enough pressure on South Africa to influence the change of regime and the destruction of apartheid there. There wasn't.
You have a very different situation.
Well, you know what? That is in the mind. That is in the mind of the beholder.
No, it's not.
And where we can disagree about that, the one thing I don't think we should disagree on is the right of the South Africans, advocates around the world to boycott in favor of South Africa, and the right of Palestinian advocates to boycott with respect to the situation of the Palestinians in the United States of America, which has a First Amendment, because it conceptually, it's no different than the civil rights movement boycotts and the apartheid boycotts.
Well, I think we agree to disagree on that. I don't agree with I personally don't agree with the constitutional analysis. I think in the end, you know, our position, the position we've articulated, will be the one that will prevail. And I think the issues outside of the legal issues are essentially political issues that we can discuss, but it's going to be very difficult to agree on. And you know, you and I have discussed it. And
we
I
keep
don't
disagreeing,
think
but-
I don't think a single state solution is viable for us, for Israelis.
By the way, let me just say that Jonathan and I have written a piece on the Huffington Post that talks about beginning this process of conceptualizing what a set of principles would be if the two peoples were to live together in one land. And if you email me, I will send you a copy if anybody's interested.
It's actually included in the links in the packet.
I don't think it was. I didn't see it there.
Yes.
One last point, and then we have to vacate the premises.
Okay, under the Sherman Act, Section 1, it says, every contract, combination, in the form of a trust or otherwise or conspiracy in restraint of trade and commerce among the several states or with foreign nations is declared illegal. I believe what we're talking about is a Sherman Act violation. And that the answer is that you can't have political speech, but it's meant to be for petitioning and going to your government officials. That's how it's been interpreted under antitrust law. And I'm having a problem here because I know that the boycotts go back to the Nazi era. And though you didn't want to discuss it, Robert, I think it's important to discuss because in Iraq in 1933, there was a German ambassador who came in, Fritz Perlman. And then there were anti-Jewish laws in 34, 35, and 36. By 39, there was an anti-Jewish school curriculum. And then there was a pro-Nazi uprising in Iraq called the Farhud, led by the Mufti of Jerusalem, Hajj al-Husseini. All of that interflected with what the Palestinians are doing now. And the idea of the Arab boycott was that they wanted to boycott sending things into Israel, boycott the state of Israel. The Arab boycott has always been accepted under U.S. law. I believe this is just another permutation of that. And it comes from what happened in Germany during the boycott situation. And that this should be covered by the Sherman Act, Section 1.
Let me just say,
That's all I'm going to say.
all right, as far as I'm aware, in the 3 cases that have been litigated in Kansas and Arkansas and Arizona. No one has raised that antitrust issue.
I'm an antitrust lawyer. I was Senate Antitrust and Monopoly Subcommittee. I worked with Senator Park and Senator Kennedy.
So I'm suggesting
and
that
I'm suggesting that this isn't. I know what the brief is. I'm telling you that I believe that this is a continuation of the Arab boycott. It's just a permutation. If it's free speech that you want, yes, you have the right to free speech, but a boycott goes beyond that. Right. Sherman Act.
Thank you. I want to thank everyone.
Thank you very
Being
much.
here.